What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my top 100 overall fantasy football rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. If you want to check out my full top 200, the link is in the description. But for this video, we're breaking down the top 100 into different tiers. I also want to specifically talk about a few players that I've, either moved up significantly or down with the news we've gotten over the past couple of days. If you enjoy the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. But let's just dive right into it. And I want to start off here in tier one. And tier one's going to have 11 players. And I feel like I'm pretty set with these top 11. I have kind of like a big five, I guess, with CMC, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson. I'd say in leagues where you can start like 4+ wide receivers, I probably do prefer Lamb and Tyreek Hill as the 102, the 103. But if you're in like an ESPN, Yahoo normal league where you can only go 2 wide receivers, 1 flex, and you think the running back's going to be flying off the board, I really have no problem going Breece or Bijan with the 102 or the 103. And then we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I just recently bumped him ahead of Jamar Chase here. I think it's officially time to be a little bit worried about this Jamar Chase contract situation. So I didn't bump Jamar Chase below Jefferson. I did move Amon-Ra St. Brown ahead of him. If you're at this point, like, I'm just totally out on Jamar Chase, I'm not drafting him. Like, I don't think that's crazy. It's definitely not ideal that he's, still not practicing with the team, or at least he didn't practice yesterday. So I think it is concerning with Jamar Chase. I'm starting to move him down, but I'm not completely like freaking out at this point. And then the last three here, 3 wide receivers, Garrett Wilson, A.J. Brown, Puka Nacua. I feel like those 3 are kind of in their own tier at the wide receiver position. Now, shifting into tier 2, I'd say the main change with this tier is that I had a few running backs drop out. So starting off with 4 straight running backs, Jahmyr Gibbs, Devon Achane, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley. I think once you're getting into the second round, the wide receiver position is very, very flat. So I'd much rather go out and get a stud running back as opposed to reaching for a wide receiver who might end up being there in like the mid to late third round, because there's really just not a ton of consensus at that position this season. So I have those 4 running backs. Then I have like the 3 wide receivers in that next group of wideouts that I do kind of prefer. So Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake London, and then Nico Collins. And then originally in tier 2, I also had Kyren Williams. He was up in that first tier of running backs. And then I also had Isaiah Pacheco next to Travis Etienne. At this point, I'm just capping this tier with Travis Etienne. I feel like at this point, he's kind of separated himself from those other running backs. Not necessarily that his situation has improved, but I think those other guys, their situations have gotten a little bit worse. And we're going to see those players in tier 3 here. So we start off with some wide receivers: Chris Olave, Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, Jalen Waddle. And then we have 3 running backs. All these guys have moved. Pacheco, Kyren have dropped for me. Josh Jacobs, I've moved up pretty significantly. So starting off with Isaiah Pacheco, the Chiefs went out, they signed Samaje Perine. Now, is Samaje Perine some amazing running back who's going to, come in and make Pacheco completely useless for fantasy? No. Pacheco's still going to be solid. I still think he probably has like mid-tier RB1 upside. But in my opinion, the reason why I was super in on Pacheco and why I'd be willing to take him in like the mid to late second was that you had that 3-down workhorse upside where Jerick McKinnon was gone. You now could see the path to Pacheco getting involved more as a pass catcher, which would obviously increase his fantasy football ceiling. But now with Samaje Perine coming in, he can catch passes. He can be a 3rd down back. I think that's obviously going to hurt Pacheco. And then also just the fact that the Chiefs felt like they needed to go out and bring someone in. It seems fairly likely that he's going to fill in that Jerick McKinnon role, which, like I said, has been the nuisance for Isaiah Pacheco. So I have dropped him. I'd still take him in round 3, but I don't know if the market's going to react as extremely. He's probably still going to go somewhere in the second. And at that price, I'm probably going to be out. I have been pretty out on Josh Jacobs throughout this offseason, but I'm definitely starting to come around here. A.J. Dillon is out for the year. He was definitely a candidate who, could have been eating into Josh Jacobs' workload. I've talked about this a ton, but LaFleur loves to run a committee. I know someone commented in my last video talking about the running backs, and they were saying, like, who's he going to be in a committee with? A.J. Dillon's not good. Marshawn Lloyd has been hurt, and all those things are true, but it really hasn't mattered to LaFleur. Like, he's fine throwing a good running back in a committee with a not great one. We saw it with Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon. Aaron Jones, very good. A.J. Dillon just hasn't been all that great. You look back when LaFleur was the offensive coordinator with the Titans, he had Derrick Henry and Dion Lewis in a pretty solid split. Like, Dion Lewis, I think, was taking 150 carries, Derrick Henry was like the 200 to 220 area. Henry was averaging nearly 5 yards a carry, and Dion Lewis was down at 3.3, and LaFleur was still pushing a heavy committee. So I'm definitely not all in on Josh Jacobs as like the workhorse, but I do think you're just looking at the competition. A.J. Dillon's out of the picture. Marshawn Lloyd avoided IR, which is a good sign, but he still might not be ready to play early on. And for a rookie, you like to see them get some continuity, during training camp, throughout the preseason. He didn't really get that because he's been banged up. So I am coming around on Josh Jacobs. I'm still a little bit concerned. He was very inefficient last year. He might just be like falling off at this point, but the upside's definitely there. And then the other guy who kind of fell here is going to be Kyren Williams. Sean McVay came out and said that Kyren Williams would be returning punts this year. And some of you guys may just, have, shrugged that off. You don't really care. But when you look at some of the top fantasy running backs, it is very, very rare that they are in there returning punts. Typically, teams think that increases the injury risk. The upside is not worth, the risk of losing them to injury. So it's not ideal that Kyren is going to be returning punts. He also has been a fairly injury-prone player, which is not great. But I think the bigger issue is that there was also a beat reporter from the Rams who came out and said that Blake Corum has really worked his way into like this first team offense, and they could definitely see this being a pretty heavy split with Kyren Williams and Blake Corum kind of splitting drives. And that's the more concerning thing. Like the punt returns isn't great, but you factor in the fact that, Blake Corum's coming in, kind of carving out a role. And like Kyren Williams could definitely pay off, but I feel like the floor is very, very low, and I don't know if people are quite recognizing it. If we remember last year, Kyren Williams was a complete afterthought for fantasy. Like he was undrafted in the majority of leagues because that was supposed to be Cam Akers' backfield. Remember, he was coming off the torn Achilles. McVay was force-feeding him towards the end of the season into the playoffs. So that was supposed to be Cam Akers' backfield. They go out. Kyren Williams isn't some high-priority free agent, some top draft pick. They go out, and within a few weeks of the season, Kyren Williams had overtaken Cam Akers. So McVay can definitely be like a little bit all over the place when it comes to his running back usage. Kyren Williams, day 3 pick. Blake Corum, they felt the need to spend a day 2 pick on him. And so maybe Kyren pays off as like a round 2 running back. But I also think when I'm just looking at Kyren versus Blake Corum, would I rather draft Kyren Williams in the second round or just take a flyer on Blake Corum, who's probably going like outside the top 100 on more platforms? Personally, I would rather just go with Corum in that spot. So I am a little bit concerned about Kyren Williams. I feel like the floor is very, very low. And this honestly isn't even me like coping with having been out on him. In my first redraft team, like my first redraft managed team, I drafted Kyren Williams in the second. I am not feeling good about that pick. So I've already invested in him and I'm not feeling great about it. So Kyren, I definitely did move him down here. And then 3 more wide receivers, Malik Neighbors, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, and then wrapping up this tier with Derrick Henry. Now shifting into tier 4, now we're getting into some of the elite quarterbacks, the elite tight ends. We start off with Brandon Ayuk, Mike Evans. This Ayuk thing is still dragging on. If you wanted to take Evans over him, if you wanted to honestly just drop him behind like all these quarterbacks and tight ends, I wouldn't push back super hard. I think if he plays, he's probably going to pay off at this price, but there's just a lot of uncertainty with some of these dudes' contracts. Mike Evans, not as high in consensus. I think Chris Godwin is going to close the gap. Then we have Laporta, Kelsey, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Trey McBride, Mark Andrews. I think the thing that's going to stick out to most people is how closely I have McBride and Andrews ranked to Laporta and Kelsey. This is something I've talked about a lot. When healthy and acting as the starter, these 4 tight ends were very, very close together in terms of their points per game. So I think the fact that Laporta, Kelsey are going like 2-3 turn, early 3rd round, and McBride, Andrews are going like mid to late 4th, I think there's a disconnect there that, shouldn't really be present. So I like kind of like that second half of that tier 1 tight ends. Then we have some more wide receivers, T. Higgins, Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell. I moved T. Higgins up with the Jamar Chase uncertainty because the issue with Higgins is that his upside is capped playing behind Jamar Chase. If Chase is now potentially missing games, having to be ramped up into the season, that's obviously going to favor T. Higgins. Plus you have like the downside of soft tissue injuries if you haven't been participating throughout training camp. So I gave Higgins a bump. Then I have James Cook, who I just think is a solid running back in this tier. And then wrapping it up with Devonta Smith. Now shifting into tier 5, it's going to cover like 2 rows here. We go Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson. I bumped up Rashee Rice with the news that he is not going to get put on the commissioner's exempt list. Seems like he's pretty much avoiding a suspension. So I did end up bumping him over Xavier Worthy, who I had them back-to-back before. So Rashee Rice, Michael Pittman, Amari Cooper, Joe Mixon, Kenneth Walker, Rachaad White in this tier. For Mixon, veteran running back on a good offense, but been an inefficient option, could kind of fall off at any point. Kenneth Walker, I think, is the most talented running back within this tier, but you also have Zach Charbonnet there, kind of uncertain usage. Rachaad White, I've come around on a little bit. He's been inefficient over the past couple of seasons, his first 2 NFL seasons, but it does seem like the Bucs are committed to getting him the ball. Solid pass catcher, should be fine in this range. And then Alvin Kamara here. I don't necessarily love drafting his archetype of player where you're drafting a veteran who we already know has kind of fallen off a little bit, but Kendre Miller went on IR. There's just not a ton of competition, and I do think it's pretty likely that the Saints try to force feed him again. I do think Taysom Hill, though, is going to be a nuisance in the red zone when it comes to the touchdown upside of Alvin Kamara. A couple wide receivers here with Xavier Worthy, Zay Flowers. We've got Anthony Richardson, who I like in this tier. Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts. I think really solid tight end picks when you're getting into round 5, round 6. And then wrapping it up with George Pickens. You could definitely make an argument for Pickens to be higher. This is really just concern about a potential Ayuk trade happening. I don't think the odds are in favor of it happening, but if Ayuk did get traded here, I think it's a pretty massive hit to George Pickens. And then we have another large tier here with tier 6, another tier that's going to cover 2 columns. We start off with James Conner, and it seems like there's kind of like this grouping on most platforms with James Conner, Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, Ramondre Stevenson. Within that grouping, I really like James Conner leading that tier. Trey Benson hasn't made as much noise as I think, at least I expected. James Conner was really good last year. I'm fairly high in this Cardinals offense, so I do like James Conner. Got some of these veteran wide receivers, Chris Godwin, Deontay Johnson, Terry McLaurin. Chris Godwin going back to the slot, I think will help him out. Deontay, new situation, clear-cut wide receiver 1. And then Terry, new offensive situation, same team, but getting a new quarterback. We'll see if he can finally have like that high upside season. And then Kyler Murray, CJ Stroud back-to-back. Talked about some of those running backs, Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, Ramondre Stevenson. Then we have Rome Odunze, a young wide receiver I'm very interested in. Calvin Ridley, probably wide receiver 1 here for the Titans with DeAndre Hopkins injured. Then I have George Kittle. Not as high as most on George Kittle. If Ayuk got traded, I would definitely be skyrocketing him. But with so many weapons, it's tough for me to have many higher here. Some young wide receivers, Brian Thomas Jr., Keon Coleman, Jaden Reed. Keenan Allen, someone I'm pretty low on here. I don't know. This just seems like a spot where I'm making a bet on Rome Odunze over him. Great prospect. Keenan Allen getting up there in age, has suffered some injuries. I do just prefer Rome to be their wide receiver 2. Some more younger guys, Christian Watson, JSN. Christian Kirk, someone I'm very low on. He's not in on 2 wide receiver sets. I like Brian Thomas Jr. And then wrapping up this tier with Ladd McConkey. And then looking at tier 7 here, got some more running backs, Raheem Mostert, Najee Harris, Evan Ingram, obviously not a running back, but then we have DeAndre Swift, Zamir White, Jalen Warren, Brian Robinson, Jonathan Brooks, Javonte. Very running back heavy tier here. These are like your running back 3s, I guess very back end RB2s. Najee gets some separation from Warren with the injury Warren's dealing with. I did bump up Javonte Williams into this tier. I do think he should be the favorite to lead this Broncos backfield. A full season removed from the torn ACL. He looked like a good player before it, so I think we get a bounce back here. And then I did have to drop Jonathan Brooks after he's going to start the season on PUP, which means he is going to miss at least 4 weeks. And then shifting into the 8th and final tier, got some quarterbacks here. Joe Burrow, Jordan Love, Dak Prescott. I bumped Joe Burrow down a tier into like this Love Prescott area because of the Jamar Chase holdout. Obviously, if he doesn't have his wide receiver 1, that is going to be a big hit for him for fantasy. Got some of these later round tight ends, David Njoku, Jake Ferguson. I think Brock Bowers was like my 101, like my 101st player or 102nd player. So he didn't quite make it, but he would still be within this tier. And then we have some committee backs, Zach Moss, Chase Brown, Tony Pollard, Tajay Spears towards the end of it. Devin Singletary should be leading this Giants backfield. And you can see Blake Corum, definitely a big riser. Some people may disagree that I have him above guys like Tony Pollard, Tajay Spears, who are probably like 50-50 members in a committee. But my thing here with Blake Corum, and I feel like I could argue him even higher, is that, maybe he's the clear 1B. You have, Kyron Williams as the 1A. Maybe Corum isn't super playable. But then you just got to think about like the different range of outcomes here. What if this is a spot where they're just, swapping drive for drive? It's pretty close to 50-50. Then Blake Corum and close to 50-50 with the Rams offense is definitely better than close to 50-50 in the Titans backfield. Then you just got to factor in things like Kyren Williams has missed a lot of time. If Kyren gets hurt, misses some games, Blake Corum instantly becomes a top 10 running back, like easily. He becomes the workhorse. And then in that situation, he now has the upside where if he plays well, he could pretty much phase Kyren Williams out of this offense. I don't think McVay has this like undying loyalty to Kyren Williams. It seemed like he had that with Cam Akers, and then Kyren Williams comes out of nowhere. Akers is kicked to the curb. So I do think Blake Corum is going to be a really solid pick in your home leagues where people haven't really caught on to this. And then wrapping up this tier with Caleb Williams, I do think he's in this grouping with Jordan Love, Dak Prescott. Jane Daniels was another player who was kind of like just on the outside looking in. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 100. If you have any fantasy questions, drop them down below. If you want to check out my full top 200, the link is in the description. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.